All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going all the way back in time
Way back.
to the 1970s.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to talk about sociobiology.
That's right.
Um,
Huge topic.
it really is.
Really, really big in the 70s.
Yeah,
And still has a lot of relevance today for philosophers especially.
absolutely. And, for our listeners out there, especially the philosophers,
Right.
you're going to like this one.
Yes, you are.
It's all about really understanding how our social behavior might actually have a biological basis.
Right.
So this is going to be a good one.
You should be.
Okay, so
Sure.
our primary source for this deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on sociobiology.
Yes. Very thorough entry.
A really good overview. And so what we're going to do in this deep dive is really give you a broad sense of what sociobiology is,
Yeah.
how it's developed over time,
Okay.
and where it stands now.
Yeah.
In particular, its relevance for philosophical questions. So
Okay. Good.
let's jump right in
Okay.
to the beginning with E.O. Wilson's 1975 book Sociobiology, The New Synthesis,
Okay.
where he defines sociobiology as the systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, just that definition alone is pretty ambitious.
Oh, it is.
Connecting those big
Yeah.
evolutionary processes with
Right.
what's going on inside of individuals.
Exactly. I mean, the link between the ecological and evolutionary causes
Yeah.
and what he suggests are potential neurological and psychological interactions
Mhm.
is really, really ambitious. And I think for philosophers of science,
Yeah.
that's really interesting,
Absolutely.
this attempt to bridge levels of explanation like that,
Right.
from population level down to individuals and then even further down to
Yeah.
neurons or genes or whatever.
Yeah.
Very, very ambitious.
It is, and it's interesting to note that this term sociobiology wasn't actually new with Wilson. It had been used before
Yeah.
to describe these kind of adaptationist approaches
Yeah.
to animal behavior.
Right.
And it was even occasionally applied to humans.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like Wilson's work really ignited
It did.
a much stronger reaction.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
Well, I think one reason is that his book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis,
Yeah.
he didn't just talk about animal behavior.
Right.
He explicitly said in the first and last chapter of the book, we can apply this kind of thinking to humans.
Yeah.
And so he
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah.
put it right out there. This is relevant for humans too.
Yeah.
And that's when the sparks really started to fly.
Yeah. And then later on human nature as well.
That's right. And that's really when people started to use this term pop sociobiology
Right.
to refer to the kind of work that Wilson was doing.
Yeah.
And that was a term that was often used by critics.
Right. And the criticisms that emerged from that were pretty huge, right?
They were.
And, I think these are going to really resonate with philosophers.
I think so.
Especially those criticisms of genetic determinism,
Right.
the role of learning and culture being downplayed,
Right.
and then this strong emphasis on adaptation.
Right. So, I mean, these really are sort of fundamental fault lines
Yeah.
in thought about human nature
Yeah.
and the role of genes and evolution and
Yeah.
culture and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like, it's almost intuitive to a lot of people, right? Like,
Right.
obviously, evolution has played a role
Yeah.
in human nature,
Yeah.
but then how much of a role?
That's right.
And are we just robots controlled by our genes?
Yeah.
So let's dive into the first aspect of sociobiology,
All right.
which is sometimes referred to as behavioral ecology.
Okay.
Um,
So what's that?
and this is really looking at how evolutionary theory
Mm-hmm.
can be used to understand animal behavior.
Right. So, I mean, this is the part of sociobiology that's actually not so controversial.
Right.
It's just the application of evolutionary biology
Yeah.
and evolutionary theory to understanding why animals do what they do.
Right.
And so one way that people have studied this
Yeah.
is to look at adaptationism.
Right.
The idea that traits evolve
hmm
because they increase the fitness of the organism.
Yeah, and so like for our listeners out there
Yeah.
who need an example,
Yeah.
I love this example of the parasitic jewel wasp.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. So this is a great example of how you can use evolutionary theory
Yeah.
to understand a really, really specific behavior.
Right.
So the jewel wasp is a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs inside blowfly pupa.
Okay.
And so the female jewel wasp
Yeah.
will sting the blowfly pupa
Okay.
and lay her egg inside. And when the egg hatches, the wasp larva will eat the blowfly pupa.
Gotcha.
But here's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
The sex ratio of the offspring that she produces
Mm-hmm.
depends on whether or not she's the first wasp to lay her eggs in that pupa.
Okay.
So if she's the first one there,
Yeah.
she'll lay about 91% female eggs and only about 9% male eggs.
Oh, wow.
Right. But if she's a super parasitic wasp,
Okay.
meaning that some other wasp has already been there and laid her eggs,
Okay.
she'll switch that ratio and she'll produce more sons.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really interesting phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
So why would a wasp do that?
Right?
Well, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective,
Yeah.
it makes sense because if you're the first wasp there, your sons are only going to be able to mate with your daughters.
Okay.
So you don't need that many sons.
Right.
But if you're the second wasp, your sons are going to be able to mate with the daughters of the first wasp.
Right.
So it pays to have more sons in that situation.
Oh, that's really cool.
And so that's just one example of how you can use evolutionary theory
yeah.
to explain a very, very specific behavior.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
So how does behavioral ecology tackle these questions of of function
Yeah.
compared to what's traditionally known as ethology?
Yeah, so ethology is the study of animal behavior,
Yeah.
and it's been around for much longer than behavioral ecology.
Yeah.
And some of the big names in ethology are people like Konrad Lorenz
Yeah.
and Nico Tinbergen.
Mm-hmm.
And Tinbergen famously came up with these 4 questions
Yeah.
that you can ask about any behavior.
Yeah.
One is, what's the proximate cause of the behavior?
Mm-hmm.
How does it work? What are the mechanisms that are involved?
Right.
Another question is, how did the behavior develop,
Mm-hmm.
over the lifetime of the individual?
Mm-hmm.
The third question is, what's the evolutionary function of the behavior?
Mm.
How does it increase the fitness of the animal? And then the fourth question is about phylogeny.
Mm.
How did the behavior evolve over evolutionary time?
Okay.
So those are the 4 questions. And behavioral ecology
Yeah.
really focuses on that third question,
Okay.
the question of evolutionary function.
Okay.
And early on, behavioral ecology
Yeah.
really focused on that question, maybe at the expense of some of the other questions.
Right.
But now I think behavioral ecologists are realizing that you really need to take all 4 of those questions into account.
Right. So it seems like, there's this,
Yeah.
we were talking before about the proximate
Yeah.
mechanisms versus
Yeah.
the ultimate explanations.
Right.
And it sounds like behavioral ecology
Yeah,
early on really focused on those ultimate explanations.
that's right.
And said, look, we don't really need to know how it works inside.
Right.
We just need to know what's the evolutionary benefit.
That's right. And they had a fancy name for that too.
Oh, yeah.
They called it the phenotypic gambit.
Okay.
And this was the idea that
Yeah.
proposed by a guy named Alan Graffin.
Mm-hmm.
And then his idea was that, well, look, we know that
Yeah.
genes and development and all that stuff is really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to understand the evolution of a behavior,
Yeah.
we can kind of just bracket all that stuff and just focus on the phenotype.
All right.
So just focus on the behavior itself.
Yeah.
And assume that there's a fairly straightforward link
Mm-hmm.
between the genes and the behavior and the fitness of the animal.
Right.
And so that was the phenotypic gambit, and it was a way of kind of simplifying things,
Right.
so that people could make progress.
Right. And make those evolutionary models that we were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
But they didn't always stick with the phenotypic gambit, right? They
Yeah.
didn't. Like they
Yeah,
started to
yeah.
realize that those proximate mechanisms were important too.
That's right.
So can you give us an example of that?
Yeah. So one example comes from work on birds.
Okay.
There's a species of bird called the great reed warbler,
Mm-hmm.
and it's often parasitized by cuckoos.
Okay.
So cuckoos will lay their eggs in the nests of other birds,
Okay.
and the host bird will then raise the cuckoo chick as its own,
Okay.
even though the cuckoo chick is often much larger than the host bird's own chicks.
Oh, wow.
Right.
So the cuckoo's taking advantage of that.
Taking advantage, yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
one of the things that great reed warblers have evolved to do
Yeah.
is to be able to recognize cuckoo eggs
Oh.
and reject them.
Okay.
And so if they see a cuckoo egg in their nest,
Yeah.
they'll often just chuck it out.
Oh, wow.
Right.
So they've evolved this like pretty sophisticated ability
Yeah.
to be able to tell the difference
Tell the difference.
between their eggs and a cuckoo egg.
Now that's an example of where the proximate mechanism is really important.
Yeah. Because if you just looked at the evolutionary function,
Yeah.
you might say, well, it's obvious why they would want to reject cuckoo eggs.
Right.
But the question is, how do they do it?
Right.
And it turns out that they have this very sophisticated visual system
Mm-hmm.
that allows them to distinguish between very subtle differences in egg coloration and patterning.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a proximate mechanism that's
Yeah.
really important for understanding the evolution of this behavior.
Right.
So that's one example, and
Yeah.
and there are other examples like that.
Okay.
There's work on jewel wasps as well, where
Mm.
people have looked at how the wasps are able to detect the presence
yeah.
of other females
Right.
at their eggs,
Mm-hmm.
and that's another example of where the proximate mechanism is really important for
Right.
understanding why they behave the way they do.
Okay, so it's not just the ultimate evolutionary advantage, it's
Yeah.
also
Yeah,
the mechanics of how
Yeah. the mechanics.
they're able to achieve that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of the
Yeah.
the tools that behavioral ecologists use to investigate
right.
this function?
So one of the main tools that they use
Yeah.
is optimality modeling.
Hmm.
And so the idea behind an optimality model
Yeah.
is that you're trying to figure out
Okay.
what the best strategy is for an animal
Okay.
given a particular set of environmental conditions.
Okay.
So, you're trying to figure out what the optimal behavior is.
Right.
And so you can build a model that takes into account all of the different factors
Okay.
that might affect the animal's fitness.
Yeah.
And then you can use the model to predict
Oh.
what the animal should do.
Okay.
And so that's an optimality model.
So in those models,
Yeah.
are they assuming that the animals are like perfectly rational?
Well, they're not assuming that the animal is consciously making these calculations.
No.
But they are assuming that
Over evolutionary time, natural selection has shaped the animal's behavior
right.
in such a way that it is behaving in a way that's close to optimal.
Okay. Yeah.
So the animal may not be consciously thinking about it,
Yeah.
but its behavior has been shaped by natural selection
Got it.
to do the best thing in that situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm curious about
Yeah.
is that assumption that the current conditions that we're looking at
Right.
are actually representative
Yeah.
of the conditions in which this animal evolved. Like,
Yeah.
how do we know that that's the case?
So that's a good question, and it's something that behavioral ecologists have to think about very carefully.
Yeah.
They have to try to understand
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
the evolutionary history of the animal
Mm-hmm.
and the environment in which it evolved,
Yeah.
and try to figure out whether or not the current conditions are similar enough
Right.
to the past conditions
Mm-hmm.
that the model is going to be valid.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
sometimes they can do that, if they have a good fossil record,
Yeah.
or if they can study the animal in a variety of different environments.
Mm-hmm.
They can get a sense of how the animal's behavior varies.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's likely that the current conditions are representative of the past conditions.
Right. So it seems like
Yeah.
they're relying on a lot of different data
They are, yeah,
to be able to.
and a lot of assumptions.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are different types of models, right?
Darn, yeah,
Like you mentioned optimality models.
Yeah. So there are other types of models as well,
Okay.
like evolutionary stable strategy models.
Mm-hmm.
And those are models that are used to understand
Okay.
how different strategies can coexist in a population. And so those are a little bit more complicated than optimality models.
Okay.
But they're also very useful
Mm-hmm.
for understanding animal behavior.
Okay.
And then there are also dynamic models.
Okay.
And these are models that are used to understand how behavior changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you could use a dynamic model
Yeah.
to understand how an animal's foraging behavior changes as it gets older,
Yeah.
or as the environment changes.
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So let's bring it back to that
Yeah.
that great example of the jewel wasp.
Yeah.
And can you give us a specific example of
Yeah.
how these optimality models have been used
Yeah.
to understand the jewel wasp?
Yes.
'Cause-
Yeah. So there's a really famous optimality model that was developed by a guy named John Warren to explain the sex ratio behavior
Mm-hmm.
of the jewel wasp.
Okay.
And his model takes into account
Mm-hmm.
the mating opportunities that are available to the sons and daughters
Right.
of the wasps.
Okay.
And so, as I said before,
Yeah.
if a female wasp is the first one to lay her eggs in a pupa,
Yeah.
her sons are only going to be able to mate with her daughters. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So in that situation,
Yeah.
it makes sense for her to produce mostly daughters
Right.
because those daughters are all going to be able to mate
Right.
and produce offspring.
And pass on her genes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if she's the second wasp to lay her eggs in a pupa,
Okay.
then the situation is different
Yeah.
because now her sons
Yeah.
have the opportunity to mate with the daughters of the first wasp.
Oh, wow.
And so in that situation,
Yeah.
it makes sense for her to produce more sons.
Right.
Because those sons are going to have more mating opportunities.
Right. So it's almost like...
And so Varen's model takes all of that into account.
Oh.
And it predicts that the sex ratio of the offspring should depend on whether or not the female wasp
Okay.
is the first one to lay her eggs in the pupa.
Okay.
And it turns out that the model actually does a pretty good job
Oh, wow.
of predicting the observed sex ratios.
Wow. So that's pretty amazing that a mathematical model
Okay.
can actually predict these.
Yeah, and so that gives us some confidence
Right.
that we're on the right track.
Yeah.
That we're actually understanding the
Yeah.
evolutionary forces
Yeah.
that are shaping this behavior.
And so for philosophers listening to this who might be thinking,
Yeah.
well, how can we really know anything about the past,
Yeah.
and how these things evolved? Like,
Yeah.
this is a really good example
Yes.
of how we can actually
Right.
use these models to understand
Right.
past evolutionary processes.
Yeah.
Uh,
And this raises a really interesting question.
Yeah.
For philosophers of science.
Yeah.
Which is, what exactly do these optimality models show us?
Right.
Right. So some people have argued that they show us that the traits that we're studying
Yeah.
are actually adaptations.
Okay.
So they're saying that, if an optimality model
Yeah.
can accurately predict
Yeah.
the behavior that we observe,
Mm-hmm.
then that's evidence that the behavior has been shaped by natural selection.
Okay.
And so those people are saying that optimality models are a way of testing adaptation.
Okay.
But other people have argued that that's not really what optimality models are doing.
Okay.
They're saying that optimality models are just a way of understanding
Mm-hmm.
the general role of selection
Okay.
and the constraints
Yeah.
that might be acting on a trait.
Right.
So they're saying that optimality models are not really a test of adaptation.
Okay.
They're just a way of understanding how selection might be working
Yeah.
in a particular case.
So I mean, this is
And so that's a really interesting philosophical debate.
right, because it's about
Yeah.
what these models are actually telling us.
What you're telling us about the world.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I think the consensus among behavioral ecologists
Yeah.
is that it's probably somewhere in between those two extremes.
Okay.
That optimality models are not a perfect test of adaptation,
Mhm.
but they are a useful tool for understanding how selection might be working.
Right. And so how would a behavioral ecologist use these
Yes.
models to test those hypotheses?
So yeah, so one way that they might use them
Yeah.
is to look for deviations from optimality.
Okay.
So if you have an optimality model,
Yeah.
and it predicts that the animal should behave in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
but then you go out and you observe the animal
Yeah.
and it's not behaving that way.
That tells you that there's something else going on,
Right. Yeah.
right? There's something else
Something else.
that the model is not taking into account.
Right.
And so that could be a constraint.
Yeah.
It could be that the animal is not physically capable
Right.
of behaving in the optimal way,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be a trade-off.
Yeah.
It could be that the animal is just trading off one benefit
Right.
for another.
Yeah. So it's not that the animal's not behaving
Okay.
optimally. It's that
Yeah.
there are other factors
That's
that
the other factor.
constraining it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So beyond just testing adaptation,
Yeah.
what else can these models tell us?
So another thing that they can tell us
Yeah.
is what's called the functional description of a trait.
Okay.
And so a functional description is basically just a way of describing
Okay.
how a trait works
Okay.
and what it does and how it contributes to the fitness in the animal.
Okay.
And so optimality models can be used
Yeah.
to generate functional descriptions of traits.
Okay.
And so, for example,
Uh-huh.
if we go back to the jewel wasp,
Yeah.
we can use an optimality model
Mhm.
to describe the function of the sex ratio behavior.
Okay.
And so the function of the sex ratio behavior
Yep.
is to maximize the number of grand offspring
Okay.
that the female wasp produces.
Okay.
And so the optimality model can tell us
Yeah.
how the wasp should adjust her sex ratio
Yeah.
in order to achieve that goal.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so I mean these models are pretty powerful.
They are, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about,
Yeah.
sociobiology in the context of behavioral ecology.
Right.
But now let's turn to the more controversial aspect of,
Yeah.
of sociobiology.
Yeah.
Which is this pop sociobiology that emerged with Wilson's application of these ideas to humans.
Yeah.
And what were the core ideas there?
Yeah. So Wilson basically argued that we can use the same tools and techniques that we use to study animal behavior to study human behavior.
Okay.
And he gave some examples of this
Okay.
in his book on human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And he argued that a lot of human behaviors have a biological basis.
Okay.
And that they've been shaped by natural selection.
Okay.
Just like the behaviors of other animals.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's a pretty big claim.
it is.
Yeah. And how did he?
How did he support that?
So he offered a number of different lines of evidence.
Okay.
One line of evidence was that certain behaviors are found in all cultures.
Hmm.
So he argued that if a behavior is found in all cultures, that's evidence that it has a biological basis. Okay.
Because it's unlikely that all cultures would have come up with the same behavior independently if it wasn't rooted in our biology.
Okay.
Another line of evidence that he offered
Yeah.
was that some human behaviors are similar
Yeah.
to the behaviors of other animals.
Okay.
And so he argued that if we share a behavior with another animal,
Yeah.
that's evidence that the behavior has a biological basis.
Okay.
And